Welcome to the PHP Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about understanding expressions and data types in PHP. When we assign values to variables, the value does not need to be fixed, and in fact in programming many times they are not. The value could be an expression. An expression is two or more values combined using an operator to produce a result. In the previous exercise, we looked at some expressions, but let's go into our development environment and do a little review so you are certain what I mean by the term expressions when we talk about expressions in PHP. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation, drop into our development environment. I want to make certain I've got my Apache server up and running, which I do. I'm going to go ahead and load up my Sublime Text 2 text editor for this demonstration, and I'll be using Google Chrome as my browser for this demonstration. And you'll notice I'm loaded exercise_1 for this particular demonstration of the tutorial. And what we want to do here is, we actually had done this in the previous exercise. I'm going to go ahead and open up my PHP blocks so I can actually put some PHP code inside my HTML document. And by the way, you'll notice this is .php. That is a requirement. If you're going to have PHP inside of a web page, instead of having it .html or .htm, we have to end it with a .php. I don't think I pointed that out in the previous tutorial, but we need to understand that in order for these pages to work and be processed by our server, they have to have the .php extension. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a variable called num1, or number1, and I'm going to have that variable equal to 12. End that with a semicolon, create a second variable, number2, have that variable equal to 13. And then I'm going to create a third variable called sum, and that sum is going to be equal to number1, and then using my plus operator, I'm going to add that variable to number2, the number2 variable that we have, and end that with a semicolon. And then what I want to do is I want to echo to my screen the value of sum. This is what's called an expression in PHP. When I take two or more variables and add those variables together, or combine those variables together, because it doesn't have to be addition, to create another variable, that's called an expression in PHP. And we do it quite often. There's many times inside our programming that we're actually going to take the value of variables, combine them to make a new variable. When we combine those variables, that becomes the expression that we're referring to. We can do it with numbers, with strings, with a combination of numbers and strings, integers, booleans. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we're going to do as we start combining variables as we work into this programming language. But I want you to understand that that's what an expression means in PHP. Let's go ahead and save this change and go in and load up exercise 1 in our browser window. And you'll notice now we're seeing the value of 25 come out based on the value of the sum variable. If these values were to change, either one of them or both, if I were to change the values of those variables, it's going to impact the value of the sum variable because it's impacting the expression that we built to create the variable. And that's what we mean by using expressions in PSP. We do them not only inside of code blocks, inside of numbers, but we actually do them with strings also. If you remember from the previous exercise, I had a code block that had a first name variable. That was one variable, and we named that one James. And again, because it's a string, it's inside quotation marks, and we always end our commands with a semicolon in PHP. Then I created a last name variable, and we had that last name variable equal to Smith, and again in quotation marks because it's a string. Then I created a name variable, and the name variable was equal to the first name variable. Then I used a concatenation symbol, which is a period or a dot inside PHP. I put a space in between them, and I concatenated the last name variable onto that string. This too is an expression. Again, because I'm taking a combination of variables and putting them together or combining them to make a new variable, that becomes an expression in PHP. And I could actually put this out on our stage by just saying print name. Remember, we talked about the print and the echo statement. There's a little bit of difference in what they do internally, but for this particular demonstration, they're going to both output to our output panel. Let's go ahead and save that change. refresh our browser window, and now you'll see that we have that James Smith displayed inside of our, and actually I meant to make that an HR, not an H2. That's why James Smith appeared so large. I wanted a horizontal rule, and it actually appeared as a heading tag. But that's how we actually combine variables and build expressions inside PHP as we're writing our code. And again, we're going to do a lot of practice with this. I just wanted you to understand what an expression is. Now I want to take a fast look at data types in PHP. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of the development environment. Let's go ahead and load back up our presentation. Because what I want to do now is I want to take a fast look at data types in PHP, because you need to understand that there are different types of data that we can have inside our PHP. And sometimes it's important to know what type of data we have. So every variable that holds a value in PHP has a data type that defines the value the variable is holding. There are numerous data types available in PHP, so let's take a look at the more common types of data that we're going to be using throughout our exercises. We have a Boolean data type, which is a truth value and can be set to either true or false. We have an integer data type, which is a number value. It can be a positive or negative whole number, no decimals. Then we have what's called a double, or sometimes referred to as a float data type, and it's a floating point number value, and it can include a decimal number. And then we have string data types, which are alphanumeric values. They can contain any number or ASCII character inside of our character set. Those are the four that we'll be dealing with most often as we go through this training set of tutorials. When you assign a value to a variable in PHP, the data type of the variable is also set based on the assignment. PHP determines the data type automatically based on the value that we've assigned to that particular variable. You can check to see what type of data type was assigned by using what's called the getType function, which is a built-in function in PHP. So let's look at a few examples of that in our development environment. I'm going to go ahead and let's drop down into our development environment. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize my presentation, get back into our development environment. Let's go ahead and load up our Google Chrome, which is our web browser for this particular exercise. I'm going to bring up my text editor. I'm going to go ahead and save the changes we have from exercise 1 and actually go and open exercise 2. And then I'm going to actually go ahead and close out exercise 1 because I don't want to overwrite that in the event that you have access to the exercise files. And the first thing I want to do again is let's go ahead and create a few variables. So I'm going to create my PHP code block, come down and close that code block, and then inside there let's go ahead and create 4 variables. I'm going to create a value variable, and I want that to be equal to 7, and with a semicolon. Then I'm going to create a variable called name. I want that to be equal to James, and that with a semicolon. And again, notice that always when we're ever creating a variable that contains a string, it's enclosed in quotation marks, even if that string were to have numbers in it. I'm going to create a variable called number, and I want that to be 5.5, and that with a semicolon. Let's create a variable called isSet. I use this variable a lot as we're working with arrays, and I want that to be set to true. And then just for kicks and grins, I'm going to create another variable called mixed, and I want this to be equal to 1,2 test. And you'll notice I enclose that inside quotation marks because again it's considered a string, and I want you to see that. Then I'm going to come down and I'm going to type echo. I'm going to put a break inside of quotation marks because we actually want this to all appear on a new line so that it doesn't get confusing. I'm going to use my concatenation symbol, and I'm going to say getType, and then inside the quotation marks, or inside the parentheses I'm actually going to type the name of the value, the variable. And in this case my first one is going to be value. I'm going to end that with a semicolon. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy that statement because we're going to be doing the same thing for each one of these variables. So I'm going to copy that statement, and then I'm going to paste it 4 times below my original. And then I'm just going to change the name of the variable that we're trying to get the type of. So the next one is going to be name. Then I'm going to type in here number, and keep in mind that all of these data types were assigned automatically by PHP when we entered the values into that variable. Then I'm going to type isSet. You'll notice I use camel case when I created that variable because in my opinion it's 2 words. and then I'm going to type mixed. Let's go ahead and save all those changes to exercise 2. Good time to pause if you need to go ahead and type these in. Now I want to go ahead and load up that exercise 2 in our browser, and we should get the data types of each one of these variables that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and load up exercise 2, and you'll notice our first data type is an integer. Again, any number, positive or negative, but it's got to be a whole number, no decimal points. Our second data type is a string, which is the word James. And you notice there we've actually asked for the data type of name. The third one now is a double or a float, and we talked about that one in the presentation. Because it's a number, but it actually has a decimal point, it's considered a double or a float data type. Then because I use true for is set, that is a Boolean data type. And you'll notice the last one, even though I have numbers in it, because it's in quotation marks, it's considered a string. So in other words, I couldn't take that number 12 inside that 12 test and add that to anything, because it's not really a true number. It's not an integer or a double that PHP would recognize as a valid value for multiplication, subtraction, division, or addition. So those are the data types that we're going to use most often as we go through these exercises. I hope this kind of clears up how data types are set. This is unusual, by the way. Most programming languages require us to do what's called strict data typing. And that's that when we create the data or the value for the variable, we actually data type the variable. In a lot of programming languages, for instance, the variable value, in a lot of programming languages, I'd have to put a colon after that and then state what type of data it's going to hold. So in PHP, it's not strict data typing. We can actually let the program determine the data type on its own, and that actually has advantages and disadvantages. There are some advantages that I can actually have mixed data types. For instance, the value variable may now be a 7, but if I wanted to make it a string, I could assign it a value of Mike or Peter, and then it would become a string value data type. So there are some advantages to not having strict data typing, but there's also some disadvantages, as you'll see as we work through the tutorials.